Welcome to this special edition of Go Vote Omaha, a program on public education, including the debate on charter schools and school choice, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm Geri Simon, a League member and the moderator. The League never supports or opposes political parties, and we present this program solely for viewer education. Here's the format for our program this evening. Each speaker will answer questions prepared by the League of Women Voters or called in by our viewers, and the number is on your screen, so do call in your questions. Each speaker will answer every question and will have up to 90 seconds to answer. The speaker who answered first will have up to 30 seconds of rebuttal time if desired. Following the questions, each speaker will have a 2-minute closing statement and will alternate the speaking order throughout. A timekeeper will signal the speakers when they have 30 seconds of time remaining and when to stop speaking. Before our program, the speakers drew lots to determine the initial speaking order, and I'll introduce both of them to you in that order now. They are Hunter-Pirtle, Executive Director of Stanford Schools, and Geri Linehan, Executive Director of Educate Nebraska. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to go to our first question, which we won't have a rebuttal, but we're going to ask, starting with Ann, please explain what Stanford Schools, when it was started, its goals for Nebraska, membership, if it's part of a national movement, and how is it financially supported?
Sure. So Stanford Schools is an organization I founded a little over a year ago. We got started in July of 2016, so we're pretty new. But we exist to advance public education in Nebraska. So in a nutshell, we support policies that help public schools better serve all students, which means things like expanding access to early childhood education, career education, school nutrition programs, and quality before and after school and summer learning opportunities. We oppose school privatization in Nebraska, whether in the form of charter schools, vouchers, or tax credits, essentially because we believe that public schools in Nebraska, for the most part, are pretty excellent. And to the extent that a handful of our schools do struggle, what's been proven to work across the country is investing in them rather than divesting. A little bit about how we got started. I am a Lincoln, Nebraska native. Got an excellent public school education in Lincoln, both Lincoln Public Schools and through the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And that education enabled me to do what I wanted to do in the world. I spent 5 years in Washington, D.C. and decided last summer to come home to start this organization. Real briefly, our startup grant was provided by the Sherwood Foundation, and we're supported by other Nebraskans as well. All of our funding is from Nebraskans, except we once got a $50 check from someone in Illinois, which was very sweet.
Okay, thank you. And now, Katie, if you talk about Educate Nebraska.
Sure. And first, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for hosting this forum and for inviting me, and for Ann for participating, and for everyone viewing tonight. I think this is a really important discussion to have in Nebraska. Educate Nebraska is a nonprofit organization, and we believe every child deserves a high-quality education regardless of zip code or income level. And we promote policies and practices that have been proven to benefit all children. I am from Omaha, Nebraska, and I went to public schools, K through 8, and then attended a private school here in Omaha. After graduating from high school, I went on to college in New Orleans and then did some work as well in DC, and both of those cities have really been transformed through educational options and families having the right to choose which school best fits their child's needs. So I came back to Nebraska in 2015, and after working at a very successful charter school network in New York City, Success Academy Charter Schools, and I came back to start an organization to give families more options and improve education overall in Nebraska, which, as Ann said, we have great schools, but we also have room for improvement. So we started Educate Nebraska. I did alongside parents and educators and community activists to really empower families to be in control of their children's education.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll go on to our topic at hand. The first question is, Nebraska is one of the states that doesn't allow charter schools. Charters or vouchers would represent a dramatic change in Nebraska's education system. What do you think necessitates such a change? And we'll begin with Katie.
Great, thank you. Charter schools are legal in 46 states. 44 states and the District of Columbia today. So we're one of 6 states without charter school legislation. Charter schools started 27 now years ago, and they've expanded again throughout the country. It was started actually by teachers in Minnesota looking for the opportunity to provide more innovative educational opportunities for students. Today, charter schools serve millions of kids throughout the country, and as they continue to exist and expand, their outcomes have gotten better and better. A child attending an urban charter school on average gains 40 days of learning in math and 28 days of learning in reading every single year. Charter schools are public schools, they're taxpayer funded, and the state creates a governing board, so it's government created, and a nonprofit in Nebraska would apply to that board and be regulated by it to operate a school. It's different than a traditional district school because if it doesn't perform well, it can and should close.
Thank you. Anne?
Well, quite simply, we don't believe that charter schools or vouchers are the answer here in Nebraska, and here are a few reasons why. Our public schools in Nebraska are very strong. We have the highest ACT score among states where a majority of students take that exam. We have one of the highest high school graduation rates in the country, and we have the 7th highest college going rate in the country. That said, even a good system is not perfect, and so to the extent that there are schools and students in Nebraska that struggle, we're going to spend time today discussing primarily those schools and students, but we shouldn't take that conversation or that lens to mean that our public schools aren't doing well. They are. So that's just a preface. Quite simply, this is not an experiment that we need to run on Nebraska kids. As Katie pointed out, charter schools have existed for 27 years, beginning with Minnesota, I believe. And the data are in, and she referenced the 2015 Stanford Credo study, which found actually very uneven progress among charter schools in urban areas. Some schools resulted in huge gains for students, and in some cities, charter schools performed worse than traditional public schools. And so rather than roll the dice and gamble in this way with public dollars on an idea that has worked far better in some states than others, we believe what makes sense is to invest in our public schools and make sure that they have the resources they need to succeed. I also want to address Katie's point about charter schools. Well, we'll get to that in a minute.
Thank you. Any rebuttal, Katie?
Yes. So we believe in investing in children, not in buildings. So a parent, more than anyone else, is likely to choose what's best for their child. There's a big difference between charter schools and vouchers and tax credits. Most importantly, though, Educate Nebraska believes a family should be able to choose whichever option is best for their child. Stanford Schools often says we have the best ACT scores in the country. That's, first of all, it's not true. And second of all, they are using data that includes private school scores. When you take private school scores out of the scores, Nebraska doesn't perform that well.
Thank you. Here's our next question, and we'll go with Anne first on this one. Some call charter schools or vouchers or scholarship funds for low-income students choice, and others say it's privatization. Which is it?
Appreciate the question. Certainly to us, it is privatization, and here's why. To Katie's point, there is some debate about whether charter schools are public schools. The National Labor Relations Board last fall actually found that, in fact, charter schools are not public schools. They are government contractors, and what charter schools are is they are typically made up of private boards of directors, which can take the form of a for-profit or a not-for-profit entity. But either way, you're sending public tax dollars and putting them into the hands of a private board of directors. And with that action comes a lot of predictable risks when it comes to waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer resources. And there have been huge scandals that have happened across the country. Ohio is a notable state to take a look at to see what's happened in the charter school sector when you have public dollars without the oversight of publicly elected school boards. That's what we believe is so critical when we're talking about public schools. So, certainly with privatization, I think it's pretty clear that when we're taking public tax dollars and sending them through vouchers or tax credits to private schools, that absolutely is privatization. And so, we believe that's a problem for the same reason. There's nothing wrong with private or parochial schools. They're great. They're a choice that families in Nebraska have. and they've existed here for decades without taxpayer support. We simply believe that we should keep public schools public.
Katie.
Again, there's a difference between charter schools, private schools, and then tax credit policies. And charter schools are publicly funded. Again, the state decides how to regulate charter schools, so elected officials at the state level are regulating them, and they're elected. Vouchers and tax credits are also a little bit different, but the Supreme Court has looked at this issue time and again, and they find that the money belongs to the parents, and the parents are the ones choosing how to direct the dollars. So it's upheld by the courts, these various programs. It's really a semantics issue on whether privatization or public. We will stand with charter schools or public schools, but Anne mentioned that the Sherwood Foundation funds her program. They also fund a program at Howard Kennedy School that's based on a charter, and one could argue that that nonprofit is also then privatizing Howard Kennedy. We don't take that position, but I think, again, that goes back to the semantics of the issue. Similarly, a lot of the charter school criticism comes from online charter schools. OPS entered an agreement with K-12 Inc., which is an online program in most states. And so OPS got to decide whether students could go to a virtual charter school. But in Nebraska, we aren't letting parents make that choice, which is really what we advocate for as an organization.
Okay. And any rebuttal?
Katie mentioned that the Kennedy Elementary School, which is part of the 75 North redevelopment project. And I just want to note that elementary school has taken kind of an innovative approach. They have a longer school day, longer school year. There was a negotiation done with the local teachers union to allow for different hours for staff at that school. And they are working in part from a model from a charter school in Atlanta. And what that shows is that we can take what works in charter schools and put it into practice in our public schools and retain that public oversight.
Thank you. Okay, now this question, this viewer says, I'm hearing about charter schools and vouchers, and I don't know exactly what that means. So what is a charter school? What is a voucher? And we'll start with Katie.
Sure. Again, a charter school is a public school, so the state has to pass a charter bill to allow children or allow a nonprofit to apply, and then the state approves or denies charter applications. Any child can attend a charter school. It's governed by the same rules. It can't discriminate. Every child has an equal opportunity to go. It's different than a traditional district school in that every child is opting into the school versus not being zoned to it. A is when the state authorizes money be given to a family so they can attend a school of their choice, including private schools. And there is a bill in Nebraska that would allow kids only zoned to failing schools. And I want to mention there are 10,000 children in Omaha schools where those schools have math and reading proficiency rates below 20%. So those 10,000 children, theoretically under this law, would be allowed to take only a portion of their funding to attend a private school. Nebraska spends $12,000 per student on average in traditional district schools. The average tuition to attend a private school is $2,000. And the outcomes in Omaha are significantly better in private schools. There's a school in North Omaha, Sacred Heart, where for more than a decade, 100% of the students go on to graduate from high school. Compare that to the fact that we have the worst graduation rates in the country for black males from our traditional district schools in Nebraska. So again, we're about empowering families to have a choice for what best suits their child.
Thank you. Anne?
So, as I mentioned, a charter school is a school that receives public funding but does not have the public oversight of an elected school board. A voucher is, as Katie mentioned, basically the state funneling public dollars toward potentially private school education as one of a range of possibilities. And the problem that we see with both charter schools and vouchers is you're taking public dollars out of public oversight, opening the door to waste, fraud, and abuse, and at the same time, you're reducing the funding available to public schools at a time when in Nebraska, according to the state's own funding formula, we've only fully funded our public schools 3 out of the last 16 years. And so we certainly believe that at a time when we're struggling to fund our public schools, we should not be talking about funneling money in other directions.
Thank you. Rebuttal, Katie?
Cost of living adjustment, Nebraska spends the 10th most in the country on public schools. We don't really have a funding problem. What we have is we're looking to fund buildings instead of children. And certainly most children in Nebraska will continue to attend, and do attend today, district schools. And they should be funded, but we should look at the money following the student to the school that best suits their need. And some children are not excelling or reaching their potential today as they could if we had school choice.
Thank you. Here's our next question. Don't we already have school choice in our public schools? How are charters any different from magnet programs that some school districts provide? And we'll start with Ann.
We certainly do have choice in our public schools. We have a huge amount of choice in Nebraska, from magnet programs in Omaha to focus programs in Lincoln, to a whole range of choices across the state. There are a whole wide variety of flavors of what public schools look like statewide. And we think that's something to be really proud of and to celebrate. I don't think there's there's certainly no ceiling on what public schools can do. Looking back at Kennedy Elementary again for a minute, there's nothing that a charter school in Atlanta can do that can't be replicated at Kennedy in terms of a charter school model, but retaining that critical oversight of an elected school board. Now, the other thing that I would say is, sorry, can you remind me of the question?
Yes, don't we
Lost
already,
my train of thought.
Don't we already have school choice in our public schools?
Oh yeah, beyond public schools, we have a whole wide variety of kinds of choice in Nebraska as well. Parents can choose private or parochial school, as well as homeschooling, or any combination thereof. There are a lot of students who are homeschooled part of the day and attend public schools part of the day. All of those options exist, and so we don't think that we should be looking to privatize public dollars by funneling them toward charter school or voucher options when we've got a really great range of choices already in Nebraska. The last thing I'll say is that we have statewide open enrollment in the state, which as far as I know is unique in the country.
Thank you. Katie.
Sure, thanks for the question. Today, choice in Nebraska is determined based on the zip code you live in and your income level. You certainly have choice to move to a different neighborhood to attend a different school, and my family benefited from that, so my siblings could get a program that better fit their needs. However, we can see, looking at the data in Omaha, that the higher performing schools in particular are at capacity, and that's true within Omaha public schools. For example, Alice Buffett Middle School, Central High School, Dundee Elementary School. They can't accept as many children who want to attend there, which shows parents are trying to exercise choice and they are not able to. We also do, to Ann's point, have inter-district and choices that you can switch from district to district. But Elkhorn Public Schools, which are among the highest performing in the state, have been at capacity for years and don't allow kids to come in because they simply don't have room. So our existing choice is not meeting the needs and demands of families currently, and certainly there aren't enough high-performing options for kids living in the poorest neighborhoods. And that's really where charter schools have come in and proven that you can have a high-quality school in a low income neighborhood. Nothing is stopping that except our outdated systems that have adopted this view that the kids are the reason schools aren't performing well versus something could change in the system. And so we're really trying to promote innovation and giving families those options.
Thank you. Rebuttal, Ann?
Well, a couple things. We think it's really important that public dollars remain within public oversight. That is so critical that we keep elected school boards in charge of our public dollars. If you take a look across the country, I mentioned Ohio, but I want to dive into that example a little bit deeper. Essentially, tens of millions of state and federal dollars went missing funding charter school students who never existed. Administrators made them up and pocketed the money. So when you take public dollars out of public oversight, you get some really predictable risks.
Thank you. Here's the next question from a viewer. How do we make sure all parents have equity in being able to make the best choice for their child's education? And the viewer says, some parents are not as prepared to evaluate programs. And we'll start with Katie on that one.
I think we underestimate what parents are able to do. Again, parents are their best advocate for their child. Certainly around the country there are programs that help families navigate their different choices. We could benefit from that in Nebraska a great deal. But putting a school in the neighborhood where kids are most desperate for higher quality options is a great way to start. Instead of saying, you could go to Millard or you could go to Westside, or if you know when to put your application in, maybe you get one of those coveted spots at Alice Buffett or Central High School. I do want to talk to Ann's point quickly about fraud. There are instances of fraud in charter schools and traditional district schools. The difference in charter schools is they're held to a higher standard. They are regulated by the state, and they close if they are doing something that is illegal. We have examples in Omaha where the schools are doing things that are questionable. And in terms of improper use of taxpayer dollars, former Superintendent John McKeel left the district with a $1 million buyout that taxpayers did not expect. And I would argue that, we can point to cases of that. That's a pretty extreme case, but we can find cases of that. It's not a reason not to pursue options and policies that are proven. Again, these are proven to work. The study after study, shows kids benefit from school choice, including the kids who choose to stay in their zone school.
Thank you. Ann?
So when it comes to equity, what we need to do is give every kid an excellent public school. There shouldn't be any question about that. That should absolutely be our goal as a society. And when you take a look at what charter schools and vouchers do, they're very often slapping a Band-Aid on a gaping societal wound. When you're talking about challenges like generational poverty, absolutely, education has a critical role to play in turning that story around, but schools can't do it alone. We need to have a broader social conversation about growing inequality in our country. And until we do that, until we get honest about it, we're going to be trying to slap a Band-Aid on with school choice on challenges that really run back decades and even centuries. And so instead, what we believe we need to do is to work now and every day to make sure that every Nebraska child has a great public school to attend. Omaha Public Schools and other districts across the state are working really hard to do that. Katie's right, there are some schools in Omaha Public Schools in particular that are really struggling. The district has put in place some very aggressive school improvement plans that are making some pretty incredible strides. Druid Hill Elementary School is a great example. This is a school that faced some significant challenges. Over 90% of students, I believe, are on free and reduced lunch at that school. And with the help of the state, they've really turned things around in a very short time frame.
Thanks. Any rebuttal, Katie?
Well, I've yet to see evidence that Druid Hill has turned around. The last scores I saw were 7% of the kids were proficient in math and reading a couple of years ago. And hopefully they have improved. We certainly support the policies that lead to improvement, but kids cannot wait for schools to improve. And families the kids that are struggling most deserve another option, whether it's through allowing charter schools or private school choice. And again, the research conclusively shows that children who remain in their zone school also improve when school choice policies are adopted.
Thank you. Here's our next question. Charter schools in Michigan do not have outside evaluation, therefore many have poor outcomes. Isn't that lack of accountability dangerous for children's learning? And we'll begin with Ann.
Absolutely, it's dangerous. Charter schools look very different in different states across the country, and as Katie pointed out, it depends sort of what parameters you put around charter schools. I haven't seen anything in the charter school bill that's been proposed in Nebraska that gives me confidence that some of the worst mistakes across the country wouldn't be repeated here. I'll go back to the Ohio example real quickly. When you've got tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer funds that go missing, you need to ask some really serious questions. And there's another example of a charter school outside Philadelphia, Greenwoods Charter School, I believe it's called, that was really playing some games with its application process. Charter schools are able to pick and choose the students that attend through an application process. And some of them are well-intentioned and want to serve struggling and perhaps low-income students. Others of them are not so well-intentioned and want to keep out exactly those students. And it's fairly easy to do that through, playing games with your application process. So at this particular school, the application wasn't available online. It wasn't available in person at the school. It was available once a year at an open house at a private golf club, miles outside the city center and miles away from access to public transportation. And so, not surprisingly, the student body at that school was the wealthiest in the district.
Thanks.
All right, we'll get back to that.
Katie.
Thank you. And I want to stray a little bit away from picking out specific examples, though now I'm going to do that myself, because this is a bigger picture issue of whether families should have choices. And now, again, we can benefit from the research shows that choice is working for kids. I will argue with Anne that about the charter law that's been proposed. It is by far the strongest charter law. Should it be adopted in any state in this country so far? So of the 6 states that haven't adopted it, the 44 other states, we would have the strongest charter law, because those of us advocating for it, the point is to make sure all kids have a high quality education. The privilege that goes along with existing school choice is perhaps most profound in Nebraska, where you can call up the administration building as a relative of maybe a principal and say, I would really like my neighbor to have a spot there. Nothing in Nebraska prohibits that. Unlike in a charter school where every child has an equal opportunity, their name is put into a hat and pulled out just as likely as the senator's son is the post office worker's daughter. So I really want to make those points also on examples. We have examples in Omaha and throughout the state and throughout the country where we actually have teachers sexually abusing children, and those schools remain open. The teachers even remain in their positions until there's enough evidence that they're pushed out. And we have tragically several stories like that in Omaha recently. So again, we can pick out these terrible examples of what's happening to kids. We think that we should advocate for what's best for kids.
Thank you. Anne, any rebuttal?
Definitely. To get back to my earlier point, I was talking about Greenwood's charter school outside Philadelphia, and the point was that after playing all these games with their application, the school wasn't forced to close. They got a slap on the wrist from the state, were told they should reform their application process, which they did to some degree, but it remained one of the wealthiest schools in the district, and they were not forced to close. The idea that charter schools are somehow held to a higher standard unfortunately doesn't bear itself out in many states across the country.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Are you eliminating students with special education or those whose parents can't provide transportation if you have charter schools? And then explain how special education and behavioral health needs are met in charters as opposed to how they are done in public schools. And we'll start with Katie.
Great, thank you. Charter schools are public schools, so they are held to the same requirements of serving special education students as traditional district schools. And often, going back to the choice issue, often parents are choosing a different school because the one they're zoned to isn't working for their child. So actually, as an example, the school I worked at in Harlem, you have more children who qualify and are receiving special education services attending those schools than their traditional school. Now, if their family's not happy with it, they have other options. If they can afford it, they can go to a private school or they can go back to their zone school. So they're the ones that are making a choice about what's best for their child. That's the benefit of school choice. So again, charter schools as public schools serve the same, under the same rules of serving children with special needs. The benefit is families get to choose which option is best for their child, and it's really important because with special needs, it can really be specific to a child. The innovations that are made possible by charter schools are also really exciting. For example, there are charter schools specifically serving children with autism or on the spectrum. There are charter schools specifically serving children, this isn't special education necessarily, but there's a school in Denver that's specific for young women who are pregnant or who have young children, babies, so they can continue their education in a supportive environment. There are charter schools that are specifically serving young people who have been imprisoned so that they learn so they don't re-enter the system.
Thank you. Anne?
there is a systemic failure among charter schools in many states to educate not only special education students, but English language learners and other students who, frankly, are more expensive to educate. Another problem with school privatization is that when you create a profit motive, whether you're talking about a for-profit or a not-for-profit organization, when you're incentivizing schools to take students, frankly, that cost less to educate, you are creating an incentive for them to discriminate in their application process or by counseling out students throughout the year, those who are harder to deal with, frankly, and who might have some additional challenges. So in New Orleans, for example, a city that all but did away with its public school system, they essentially only have charter schools and parochial schools now. There was a federal lawsuit that took 4 years to resolve, essentially with no school board providing oversight. Some special ed students were out of school for 4 years. It's how long it took the lawsuit to be resolved. There was no entity making sure that those children were in school at all. So certainly there are some charter schools across the country that cater specifically to whether it's special education, ELL students, or other specialized populations, as Katie mentioned. But there's no guarantee that charter schools are going to pop up to serve populations of kids in the way that we need them to. That's entirely up to the operators.
Thank you. Katie, any rebuttal?
Yeah, so I meant to ask you last time, I don't know that case in New Orleans. It's unacceptable. We certainly would not want that to happen. There's state oversight of charter schools, so the state in Nebraska would be responsible for making sure that doesn't happen. On the profit model, this keeps coming up. Charter schools in Nebraska under the law would have to be non-profit entities, and the majority of charter schools in this country are. An exception is the online school that OPS contracted with. That is a for-profit model. So I'm not sure if OPS is agreeing to give them a profit or not.
Thank you. Here's our next question from a viewer. If a student is expelled from a charter school, they return to the public school. How can public schools recover the funding for that child that has already been paid to the charter school? And we'll begin with Ann.
The short answer is I'm not sure that it happens. Charter schools do expel students at a rate staggeringly higher than traditional public schools because they can. In Washington, D.C., charter schools expel students at a rate about 15 times that of public schools. In Chicago, it's something like 50 times higher. Because public schools serve all students, must and should, they are required to serve all kids. All means all. Charter schools are able to, like I said, discriminate both in the application process because they're able to, let's say that you only make your application available in English. All of a sudden, a whole population of families whose parents might not speak English are unable to fill out that application and wouldn't be able to attend the school. Or another common thing is for students to find themselves at a charter school and to be taken aside by a counselor and told that they don't really fit the culture of the school, that they're going to have trouble keeping up if they're not directly expelled. And so through all these ways, charter schools very often in many states find ways to pick and choose their students, leaving public schools to serve all kids, as they always should.
Thank you. Katie.
So that's just not true. Charter schools cannot discriminate, and their suspension expulsion policies have to be in compliance with state law, just as Omaha Public Schools, Westside, Millard, et cetera, have. On the issue of having application rules to try to cherry pick students, we could really get in the weeds on that. I would point again that the existing school choice in Nebraska has those problems, and I would love to join Stanford schools and advocate for policies that outlaw that, because I think it is a problem that's going on where people with privilege have even additional choices besides being able to pay for an option. The most important thing though is people who are advocating for charter schools are starting them because kids are not being served in the existing schools. Charter schools serve more kids with special needs, more low-income children, more children of color than the district school as a whole, and the results are, again, every year they become more and more profound. ultimately better for kids that aren't being served in the district school. It makes sense. Their needs weren't being met there. And I'd like to go back again to the research that conclusively shows, dozens of studies show that the children who remain in the existing schools, their outcomes also improve when school choice policies are enacted. And one reason that most likely is because their needs are being met in the schools. They are not for lack of resources. Again, the money follows the child, so their funding remains in the school.
Thank
Charter.
you.
Oh,
Thanks.
sorry.
Any rebuttal, Anne?
Yeah, this idea that the funding follows the child sounds nice in theory, but the truth is that fixed costs, or costs for a lot of public schools, remain relatively fixed. If you imagine a public elementary school, let's say, and let's say that we open a charter school nearby, and a couple of children decide to go to the charter school, you don't lose a whole class size. You need the same number of teachers. You need the same size building. And so the cost savings that charter proponents talk about don't actually materialize in the real world, unfortunately.
Thank you. Here's our next question. Legislation has been proposed in Nebraska to give tax credits or deductions to individuals who donate to scholarship funds for low-income students. Those scholarships are then used at private schools. But tax dollars are foregone to give the tax credits or deductions. So isn't this really diverting tax dollars to private schools and ultimately undermining the public school system? And we'll begin with Katie.
Thank you. And this is on the tax credit scholarship bill, LB 295. This policy is in other states, and it has been challenged by the courts, and they've always found, and it makes sense, that the money does not belong to the state. It's not state tax dollars, it's the taxpayer money. So that belongs to the taxpayer, and under a tax credit policy, they can choose, if they have a $1,000 obligation of income taxes, they can choose to direct that to a scholarship fund, such as Children's Scholarship Fund here in Omaha that provides low-income kids opportunities to attend private school, or they can give it towards the traditional income tax route. Either way, they're out the money, so they do not profit from it. Who profits are the kids who have another opportunity to attend a school that works best for them. And tax credit scholarships in particular have shown to save the state a great deal of money. In Florida, for every dollar the state does give up in revenue at the front end, they save $1.60 because those children are then educated in a different school that's not taxpayer funded. So with that extra revenue, which in Florida today is millions and millions of dollars every year, they can put that towards the programs Anne talked about to reduce poverty, to empower parents, to put more money in the traditional district schools, to create after-school programs, preschool programs, which Florida has universal pre-K, in part funded because of programs like that save the taxpayer dollars while providing kids with more opportunity.
Thank you. Anne?
So you're referring to LB 295, and this tax credit really is an opportunity for the wealthiest Nebraskans, in fact, to get wealthier. The way this program would work is you'd get a dollar-for-dollar tax credit on a donation to a private school scholarship program. And then on top of that, you would also be able to claim a federal charitable giving deduction on that money. Corporations are eligible to make those donations and reap the benefits, and frankly, you have to have money to benefit. This isn't about helping middle class or low income Nebraskans pay for school, it's about helping wealthy people get wealthier. The other thing I want to note is that currently, when you donate to a private or parochial school, assuming it's set up as a nonprofit organization, you already are able to take a tax deduction on your donation, as you would for any charitable organization. And I'm a little bit confused as to what makes private school scholarships, need their own dollar-for-dollar tax credit. Certainly, the state is foregoing those funds. And so if we're talking about taking either $2 million or $10 million a year, as is written in this bill currently, out of the state's general fund, absolutely that can have an effect on public schools. It could also impact roads, healthcare, the whole range of services that matter to all Nebraskans. And so we believe that those public dollars need to remain in public oversight.
Thank you. Katie, any rebuttal?
Yeah, I'd happy to talk to you about this, Anne, afterwards. That's not true. No one can profit off the tax credit scholarship. You already get to deduct your income taxes from federal taxes, so it's at most, there's no savings to the taxpayer. who you asked who benefits, the kids benefit who can go to a different school. And in terms of the state saving currently on private schools, the state every year saves close to $500 million because so many kids today are in private schools. What's stopping more kids from being in private schools is their income level, which we don't think is just.
Thank you. Our next question. Public schools are required by law to accept and teach all children in their district, so public schools are by definition inclusive and diverse. Since charter schools rely on vouchers, lotteries, quotas, scholarships, and other methods that exclude some children from attending, how can charters reflect the diversity of America? And we'll begin with Anne.
Can I let Katie take that one?
Sure, sure. Okay, now I was gonna write down so I could remember the question. So I think this is part of the unfortunate aspect of the rhetoric of people who are opposed to giving families more opportunities. Charter schools are public schools. They are different than vouchers. Charter schools cannot discriminate. They are, in terms of children that can go, they're the same as district schools, which means all children can go. They're limited only in the space available. It's really tragic. I know many charter schools, for every one spot they have available, 100 children want to go. And we have that in traditional school choice here in Nebraska too. We believe that the one way to address that is to open more high-performing schools to give families more opportunities. Vouchers are money given for private schools, and tax credits are funds created by taxpayers so they can fund scholarships. So those are also different. Private schools do not get funding for special education, so they at times are accused of not accepting all kids for that reason. If they got $100,000 a year that would follow a high needs student, then they might operate differently. However, there are examples such as Madonna School here in Omaha that specifically serves special education students. And the sponsor of a past tax credit bill, I believe his daughter, Senator Bob Christ's daughter, goes to Madonna School. And that really shows an example of why these schools can help so many kids.
Thank you. Anne.
To the question asker's point, public schools do indeed serve all students, and they should. Charter schools, whether they mean to or not, do discriminate in the application process. By simply having an application, you're creating a bar that some families can't clear. And again, I think we should be really concerned about putting taxpayer dollars out of public oversight. I think that, when we're talking about the services that are most essential in our country, public education has to be really high on that list. And public schools absolutely should serve all children, and they do.
Okay, thank you. Katie, since you talked first, you get the rebuttal.
Great. Charter schools' application process is generally simple, and it's required because there aren't enough spaces for the kids to go. In Omaha, I believe the process for opting into, say, Dundee Elementary School or Central Elementary School, I do not think that application form is as in many languages as OPS teaches. So that's an example where kids who speak English and their parents have more opportunity to understand the opt-in program, and that's an example of discrimination, or rather privilege, potentially under your definition in Omaha. And charters, look to avoid that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Now, here's the next question. Should charter schools be required to be accountable for student progress in the same way as public schools? In other words, using the same yearly assessments and standardized tests? And we'll start with Katie.
Yes, absolutely. Charter schools have more autonomy, and in return, they have greater accountability. It's really a false narrative to say charter schools aren't held accountable. They're held to a much higher standard, and those advocating for them fight for that. We push for legislation and policies that mean if the charter school is not working, it should not continue operating at all, or certainly should have to make major changes. Under Nebraska's system, there are no consequences when a school fails to educate kids for decades. I'll throw that number out again, that there are 10,000 children in Omaha schools today where those proficiency scores, math and reading combined, is below 20%. Those schools, many of them, some have gotten worse, some have improved. We certainly are working to promote policies that ensure that those schools are given the resources to improve, but today, thousands of kids, it's their only option, and not the state really is not doing anything to force those schools to improve or hold them accountable if they don't improve. And that's one area where charter schools differ a great deal. I will admit one reason charter school outcomes continue to improve and really are doing so much better today than traditional district schools is because those that weren't working were forced to reform or close. And some states have adopted policies where if there is a school that has 10% proficiency in math and reading, let's say, the district hands it over to a charter school so it will improve.
Thank you. Anne?
Charter schools are not held to a higher standard than public schools, at least certainly not in every state. The New York Times has done a couple of long-form pieces, one just a couple weeks ago in the magazine, that took a deep dive in looking at charter schools in Detroit in particular. Detroit is certainly a struggling city in many ways. It's lost something like 2/3 of its population over the last few decades. So their public schools certainly have challenges, but with unfettered charter schools in Detroit, there are families who've seen charter schools close every single year and have sent their kids to multiple schools and haven't been able to get a decent education.
Katie, rebuttal.
Can't remember what he said. I think, again, going back to these examples, well, in this city or this state, you mentioned Ohio, which needed to and has reformed its charter law and is doing great. You mentioned DC, where the charter schools aren't held accountable. I'll point out DC had the worst performing schools in the country before education reform really took hold in that country. Kaya Henderson, who was an outstanding chancellor of schools and the current chancellor of the traditional district schools, who's from Lincoln, Nebraska, actually a gentleman, both are huge supporters of charter schools. So they are in power over the district schools, but support charters and really work together to lift all boats.
Thank you. Our next question. How do we ensure separation of church and state in charter schools? Specifically, how do we ensure particular religious beliefs or dogma are not integrated into the curriculum and school management? And we'll begin with Anne.
That's a challenge in some states. Arizona is a good example of a state where, as far as I understand it, just about any entity can start a charter school, and you can even start a charter school for the purpose of furthering a cult. You can make up your own religion and get state money to start a charter school to indoctrinate children into your made-up religion. That's something that we should be really concerned about. Now, I think, frankly, that there are greater, more systemic concerns with charter schools as we look at what's being proposed in Nebraska. And I actually think that separation of church and state is a concern as well when it comes to vouchers and tax credits. The Supreme Court has ruled that vouchers are an acceptable use of taxpayer dollars in some states, but we think that we're better off investing those funds in our public schools and making sure that they work well for all kids. We think that's super important. So I think that's a concern, but perhaps not the greatest concern when it comes to charter schools.
Thank you. Katie.
And I just want to pick off your last word. We believe you should invest in children and their potential, not in school buildings. So regardless of what type of school it is, that is where the investment should be in. This, again, I think confuses the issue. Charter schools are public schools. They can discriminate or teach religion or anything no more than a traditional district school can. And the idea that some rogue charter will open and teach cult or run by a cult, state lawmakers under the bill are responsible and should be held accountable for the type of charters that we allow and continue to exist, just like OPS board would be responsible for allowing that sort of thing to happen in one of their schools.
Okay, thank you. Any rebuttal, Anne?
No, I think we covered it.
Okay. Our next question, do you support the use of school vouchers? How do they differ from scholarship funds set up to send children to private schools? And we'll begin with Katie.
Sure. Educate Nebraska supports school vouchers for low-income children, tax credits for low-income children, but they are different. So again, under the voucher bill, it would allow a child attending a failing school, which unfortunately in this system of education we have in Nebraska, most likely means they're low-income kids, and in Omaha, kids of color that are attending the lowest rating schools in the state. Again, schools with as proficiency rate as low as 7% in math and reading. Kids in those schools would be able to take a portion of the, on average, $11,000 that is allocated for their education to take it to a private school, but no more than the cost to educate, which in Nebraska is $6,000. The remaining amount, $5,000 to $6,000, would be split into a taxpayer relief fund and to stay with the traditional district school. So in fact, for every child who left one of these failing schools for a private school, the district school would actually keep money above the fixed costs that you mentioned earlier. So that's how vouchers work. Tax credits, to review, it's never state money. A taxpayer directs money into a scholarship granting organization, such as Children's Scholarship Fund, to give a child the opportunity to attend a private school through a scholarship. So that child potentially was never going to the district school, but it allows low-income kids to have that same opportunity that middle and high-income families have.
Thank you. Anne?
So a voucher is, the state providing funds for a child to attend potentially a private school, whereas a tax credit is a donor, donating to a school's scholarship program and getting, a dollar for dollar tax credit on that money. Now, the idea that a tax credit doesn't affect public schools, or that a voucher doesn't affect public schools, is a little misleading. Anytime that you are either removing or taking out state funds or preventing them from going into the state's general fund, absolutely you can have an impact on not just schools, but roads and healthcare and the other services that we all care about. So the idea that tax credits don't cost the state anything is certainly misleading, and they absolutely can damage public schools. LB 295, which is the tax credit bill that's been introduced in Nebraska, could be highly damaging and is something we should be, really aware of as we look forward. Katie, I want to raise a question on a slightly different issue. I certainly believe that you care very deeply about children in Nebraska and about their education. But as far as I'm aware, you've never stated where your funding comes from, and you didn't do so at the top of the hour. So I'd like to ask that to you directly.
Sure. Is this on my time?
Go ahead and answer. We'll let you
Okay,
answer.
and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to avoid that question. So Educate Nebraska is, I don't have the percent, probably 70% of our work is through volunteer work, and we aren't funded at a level that requires us to report to the IRS because we haven't met that benchmark. Most of our funding is, no funder above $10,000 annually. And most of our work really is grassroots through parents, educators. I volunteer the majority of my time to this effort. So we don't have big funders. I know, Anne, you've accused us of being funded by the Kochs. We certainly aren't funded by the Kochs or any outside billionaires.
Okay, thank you. And then you do get to have a rebuttal on the voucher question. So.
Okay, now I have to go back and remember what the voucher question
Do you
was.
support school vouchers, and how do they differ from scholarship funds?
Oh, I think I answered that first. Oh, the rebuttal.
So
Your
the
rebuttal.
If you would
okay.
like to rebut.
Which I think
can.
is really just hashing out the same thing again. But I would say, when we say money is being taken away from schools, is it being taken away from children, who we're saying the money should follow them, or is it being taken away from a system that the adults who benefit from that system are protecting? So generally the teachers union is opposed to school choice because kids would be going to a school that's not governed by teacher union contracts. And that really often is a black and white issue that's not talked about directly. Also bloated administrative costs, which are huge in Nebraska, might be impacted.
Great. Thank you both. It's now time for closing statements. The hour went by quickly.
Yeah.
So we'll begin with Anne Hunter-Pirtle.
Great. Well, thank you again to the League of Women Voters and to Katie for taking part. I just want to remind folks that Nebraska has really excellent public schools in a lot of ways. Again, we have the highest ACT score in the country among states where a majority of students take that exam. We have the 7th highest college going rate in the country and one of the nation's highest high school graduation rates. We should be really proud of those facts, and we shouldn't take them for granted. Tonight, we spent a lot of time talking about the relative handful of schools that are struggling in Nebraska. And it's good that we did that. It's appropriate to put time and attention toward the schools and students that need it most. But we shouldn't lose sight of the strengths of our public schools in Nebraska. And meanwhile, even when we are talking about the schools and students that struggle. School choice sounds like a great concept, but in fact, school privatization comes with significant costs to our public school system, one that supporters of those policies don't always acknowledge. And so I think the question we need to ask ourselves in Nebraska is not whether charter schools are good or bad, or whether vouchers or tax credits are good or bad. The question we need to ask ourselves is what strategies will allow us to best serve all students in Nebraska. And from my perspective, and according to huge reams of research, the thing that works best when we've got as strong a public schools as we have in our state, it's investing in our public schools, it's investing in our kids, investing in our teachers. And I don't just mean that in terms of money. I mean giving schools and students and families the resources in every sense of the word, in terms of teacher expertise, innovative programs, and many public schools across the state are doing that allow them to succeed. And so that's what we need to look at when we think about school choice.
Thank you. Now, Katie Linehan, your closing statement.
And again, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for having this. I think it's an important issue. We often aren't on even grounds in our ability to educate folks on this issue. And this, first and foremost, is about kids. We, and everyone I work with, is trying to do what's best for kids. I don't not believe that you aren't trying to do the same thing. But we think that families, first and foremost, should be able to direct the course of their child's education. It's a benefit in Nebraska because we're so far behind on this issue that we can say, look how it's not only working, it's working in extraordinary ways across this country. And again, where no children are being hurt. There are no studies that show that kids who stay in their zone school are hurt by other families having choices so that they can go to a school that is working for their kids versus the one that is not working. If it was working, they wouldn't want a different choice. It's also about educators. I taught in a public school that served mostly low-income children, and I've worked with kids in Omaha from struggling neighborhoods and who are trapped in schools that aren't working for them. And as an educator and someone who works closely with educators, I can say that the innovation school choice allows them to pursue is also something that many are interested in, but sometimes afraid to speak out about because the pressure in Nebraska is so heavy to be opposed to this idea that seemingly people don't necessarily understand as well as they often appreciate learning about. So again, thank you for this opportunity. On the ACT scores, and I don't want to end it on this note because it's about opportunity and equality, but often the side against school choice says that our ACT scores are high. If you take out the private schools, they aren't that high in Nebraska. It's actually startling information. So I would look into that, whereas our private schools are off the charts, especially with African American and Latino kids in the Omaha Archdiocese schools.
Thank you very much. This concludes our public education debate on charters and school choice, and is it choice or is it privatization? Thanks again to our guests for being here this evening, to Katie Linehan from Educate Nebraska and Hunter-Pirtle from Stanford Schools. We really appreciate both of you being here and talking about the issues.
Thank you.
For the League of Women Voters, I'm Geri Simon, reminding you to inform yourself about the issues, and at election time, go vote, Omaha.